What happens when a country spends 50 years building its entire military strategy around one narrow strip of water, and then wakes up one morning to find that strip of water no longer matters? That is exactly what is happening to Iran right now, and the people in charge of its military know it. Before we go further, if you have ever wondered how a handful of pipelines could quietly dismantle one of the most feared threats in modern geopolitics, stay with me for the next few minutes, because this story is not just about oil. It is about power and how power can vanish overnight. If stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe now, because this channel breaks down the hidden engineering and strategy behind the headlines. Nobody else explains this clearly. For nearly half a century, there has been one sentence that could shake global oil markets within minutes. Iran threatens to close the Strait of Hormuz. Every time those words appeared in a headline, oil traders across the world froze. Prices jumped. Airlines recalculated fuel costs. Shipping companies rerouted vessels. Entire national economies held their breath. Why did 5 words carry so much weight? Because of geography. Look at a map of the Persian Gulf and you will see a narrow channel squeezed between Iran on one side and Oman on the other. At its tightest point, this channel is only about 21 miles wide. Through this single passage, roughly 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil consumed on planet Earth used to travel every single day. Saudi crude, Kuwaiti crude, Emirati crude, Qatari gas, almost all of it funneled through this one gap in the water. Iran sits right beside it. And for decades, that simple fact gave Iran something money cannot buy: leverage. Not the leverage of armies marching across borders, not the leverage of nuclear warheads. A quieter, sharper kind of leverage: the ability to whisper a threat and watch the entire global economy flinch. Iran built its military doctrine almost entirely around this one geographic advantage: fast attack boats that could swarm oil tankers, anti-ship missile batteries hidden along the coastline, naval mines that could be scattered across shipping lanes within hours, radar systems and drone units built specifically to track and threaten vessels the moment they entered the strait. None of this was designed to conquer territory. It was designed to do one thing: make the world afraid that oil might stop flowing. And it worked for a very long time. Every time tensions rose between Washington and Tehran, the same question echoed across trading floors from London to Tokyo. What if Iran actually closes Hormuz this time? That fear alone was worth more to Iran than most conventional weapons ever could be. Fear is a currency, and Iran spent decades collecting it. But currencies can collapse. And right now, in real time, that is exactly what is happening to Iran's most valuable strategic asset. Quietly, without press conferences or dramatic announcements, the United States and its closest Gulf allies have spent the last several years building something that strips away the very foundation of Iran's leverage. Not through bombs, not through invasion, through steel pipes buried in desert sand. Let's talk about what has actually been constructed, because once you understand the scale of it, you will understand exactly why Tehran is rattled. At the center of this shift is an expanded pipeline system running straight across Saudi Arabia, connecting oil fields near the Gulf Coast in the east to brand new loading terminals on the Red Sea coast in the west. This is not some experimental prototype. The original version of this pipeline has existed since the 1980s, built during the brutal Iran-Iraq War as a backup route, in case Hormuz ever became too dangerous to use. But for decades, that backup route stayed exactly that: a backup, limited in size, rarely pushed to its full potential. That changed quietly starting around 2021. Saudi engineers began expanding pumping stations. They widened pipeline diameters along critical stretches. They constructed massive new loading terminals at the port city of Yanbu on the Red Sea. What was once a modest emergency route capable of moving a few million barrels a day has been transformed into a high-capacity artery capable of moving well over 10 million barrels daily, some estimates placing the ceiling even higher. Enough oil to reroute a significant share of what used to depend entirely on Hormuz. Think about what that number actually means. It means Saudi Arabia, the largest oil exporter connected to the Gulf, no longer needs Hormuz to remain open in order to keep its exports flowing. Crude can move overland, avoid Iranian waters entirely, and reach tankers waiting on the other side of the peninsula in the Red Sea, ready to sail toward Europe and Asia through the Suez Canal. But Saudi Arabia was not alone in this effort. The United Arab Emirates built its own escape route years earlier, a pipeline running from inland oil fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman coastline, positioned outside the strait entirely. That pipeline became fully operational back in 2012, but for years it ran under capacity, treated more like insurance than a primary export channel. Nobody wanted to pay for redundant infrastructure, when the main route still worked fine. That calculation has completely flipped. As tensions with Iran escalated and closure threats became louder and more frequent, that pipeline stopped being a backup plan and started being pushed toward full operational capacity. Emirati crude now flows directly to open ocean terminals, completely bypassing the narrow channel that Iranian gunboats patrol. Then Kuwait joined the network. A newer pipeline connection now links northern Kuwaiti oil fields into the Saudi system, allowing Kuwaiti crude to travel overland and reach the same Red Sea terminals rather than relying exclusively on tankers threading through Hormuz. This required serious coordination between three separate governments: transit agreements, security arrangements, shared infrastructure planning, the kind of cooperation between Gulf Arab states that, honestly, has rarely existed at this scale before. Now picture the terminals themselves, because this is where the engineering becomes genuinely impressive. The expanded facility at Yanbu can now store more than 60 million barrels of crude oil. That is an enormous buffer. It means that even if pipeline flow fluctuates or maintenance shuts down a section temporarily, tankers can keep loading without interruption because there is a massive reserve sitting ready. On the other coast, the terminals at Fujairah have been upgraded with deep water channels, wide enough to accommodate the largest crude carriers on the planet, plus offshore mooring systems allowing tankers to load safely even when weather conditions would shut down a conventional harbor. Put all of this together, and here is the blunt reality. Saudi Arabia can send its oil west. The UAE can send its oil east. Kuwait can route through Saudi Arabia's system. And when you combine the total capacity of these bypass routes, it now exceeds the total volume of oil that used to pass through the Strait of Hormuz on an average day. Read that again, because it matters. The alternative routes can now carry more oil than the strait itself ever moved. That single fact rewires the entire balance of power in the Persian Gulf. If you're starting to see why Iran's military planners are losing sleep over this, imagine how the actual decision makers in Tehran feel watching it unfold in real time before we go deeper into how this changed the battlefield and the oil markets. Do me a quick favor. Tap that like button right now. It genuinely helps push videos like this one in front of more people who care about understanding what's really happening behind the headlines, not just the surface level news everyone else repeats. Now let's talk about timing, because the timing of all this is not an accident. It is, frankly, one of the most patient, strategic moves in recent Middle East history. Notice something important. Every phase of this pipeline expansion happened before the current wave of conflict between Iran and its adversaries intensified. The Saudi expansion began in 2021. The UAE pipeline reached full capacity around 2022. The Kuwaiti connection came online in 2023. None of this was a rushed emergency response to a sudden crisis. This was slow, deliberate infrastructure planning, built years in advance, almost as if someone anticipated that Hormuz would eventually become a flashpoint and wanted the exit ramp already built and tested before that day arrived. At the time each project was announced publicly, the official reasoning sounded almost boring. Officials talked about export diversification. They talked about reducing congestion at existing ports. They talked about operational flexibility. Nothing in the press releases screams strategic warfare, and that is precisely the point. If you wanted to quietly dismantle your rival's greatest source of leverage without triggering a dramatic confrontation, this is exactly how you would do it. Slowly, boringly, underneath the radar. While the world's attention stayed fixed on more dramatic headlines elsewhere. By the time Iran began escalating its threats against shipping in the Strait, the bypass network was not some future plan on paper. It was already built, already tested, already capable of absorbing the shock the moment it was needed. And here is where the story gets genuinely dramatic, because we can actually watch the results happening in real time through shipping data. Tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has dropped significantly over recent months, with some tracking estimates suggesting a decline of roughly 40% compared to normal volumes. Now, that drop is not because Iran successfully blocked ships. It is because ship owners and oil companies are choosing not to send their tankers through a danger zone when a safer route now exists. Vessels that would have once loaded oil in the Gulf and threaded through Hormuz are now loading directly at Yanbu or Fujairah and sailing toward their destination without ever entering Iranian threat range. Insurance markets confirm the exact same story. And insurance markets rarely lie because money never lies. War risk premiums, the extra insurance costs charged specifically for sailing through dangerous waters, have spiked repeatedly during recent Iranian threats and provocations for vessels still using Hormuz. Every time Iran issues another closure warning, every time there's a drone incident near a tanker, those premiums jump again. Meanwhile, insurance rates for vessels loading at the bypass terminals on the Red Sea and Gulf of Oman have stayed remarkably stable. The market has already made its judgment. Hormuz is risk, the bypass is safety, and capital always follows safety. This creates something economists call a self-reinforcing cycle, and it is brutal for Iran. The more aggressively Iran threatens the strait to try to reassert its leverage, the more shippers abandon the strait entirely and shift permanently toward the bypass routes. Iran's own aggression is accelerating the exact outcome it is desperately trying to prevent. Every missile test, every naval provocation, every fiery statement from state media pushes another handful of shipping companies to make the switch permanent instead of temporary. Now think about global oil prices for a moment, because this part genuinely surprised traders around the world. For decades, any hint of Hormuz tension sent oil prices climbing almost instantly, driven by fear of a supply shock. But watch what happened recently when Iran publicly declared threats against the Strait. Brent crude did spike briefly, just like clockwork, just like it always had before, except this time, within days, prices quietly slid back down to where they had started. Why? Because traders realized something that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The oil kept flowing anyway. Refineries kept receiving their shipments on schedule. Tankers kept loading, just from different ports. The disruption that traders feared simply never showed up in the actual supply numbers. And once markets learned that a threat does not translate into real consequences, they stopped reacting to that threat with the same fear. Each failed closure attempt chips away a little more at the psychological power Iran once held over global energy markets. That psychological power was arguably more valuable to Iran than any weapon in its arsenal, and it is evaporating in front of our eyes. Let's step back and really sit with what this means for Iran strategically, because the implications go far beyond oil tankers and pipelines. For 50 years, Iran poured enormous resources into building a military designed around one core assumption. That controlling access to Hormuz meant controlling leverage over the entire world. Billions of dollars went into coastal missile batteries, billions more into naval mine stockpiles, fast attack boat squadrons trained specifically for swarming tactics against tankers, radar networks and surveillance systems built along the coastline, all oriented toward one single mission: threaten the strait, and the world listens. That entire military doctrine now sits on a foundation that has quietly crumbled beneath it. Iran can still technically sink a tanker in the strait tomorrow if it chooses to. It can still lay mines. It can still fire missiles at passing ships. Nobody is claiming Iran has lost its ability to cause damage in that specific waterway. But here is the brutal truth underneath all of it. Even if Iran successfully disrupts shipping inside Hormuz, the global oil supply barely notices anymore, because the majority of Gulf oil no longer needs to pass through that channel at all. Imagine spending 50 years building the world's most feared lock, only to discover that everyone quietly built a new door on the other side of the house. That is essentially what has happened here. The weapon still exists. The target it was built to threaten simply stopped mattering as much. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding the real story behind global power shifts, not just the surface headlines. So let's make a small deal. Drop a comment telling me one word that describes how you think Iran's leadership is feeling right now watching all of this unfold. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what stories we dig into next. Now let's talk about why Iran cannot simply build a countermove to fix this problem, because that is the question everyone eventually asks. Surely a country with Iran's military capability can adapt, right? Here is the uncomfortable answer for Tehran. Geography does not negotiate. Iran's entire military advantage around Hormuz existed because of proximity. Its coastline sites right beside the strait, giving its missile batteries, its fast boats, and its mine-laying vessels a short, quick reach into the shipping lanes. That proximity advantage simply does not exist anywhere near the new bypass terminals. Yanbu sits on the Red Sea, hundreds of miles away from Iranian territory, protected by geography itself. Fujairah sits on the open waters of the Gulf of Oman, outside the narrow confines where Iranian coastal weapons were designed to operate. Iran cannot simply relocate its missile batteries to threaten these new terminals, because the distances involved make that kind of coastal threat physically impossible with the systems Iran currently possesses. Could Iran theoretically use proxy forces to threaten shipping through a different choke point, like the Bab el-Mandeb Strait near Yemen? In theory, yes, and there have been attempts at exactly this kind of pressure through regional proxy groups. But that is an entirely different battlefield, with different defenses, different naval coalitions patrolling the area, and different escalation risks. It is not a simple substitute for the leverage Iran is losing at Hormuz, and those proxy capabilities have themselves been worn down significantly by sustained pressure from coalition military operations throughout the ongoing regional conflict. What about sabotage against the pipelines directly? This gets discussed constantly in strategic circles, so let's address it honestly. Yes, in theory, someone could attempt to damage a buried pipeline running across Saudi territory. But compare the difficulty of that task to sinking a moving tanker at sea. Pipelines are stationary. They can be buried underground. They can be monitored continuously with sensors and patrols. Attacking fixed infrastructure deep inside another sovereign nation's territory is an entirely different level of military and political risk than intercepting a ship in open water. And even in the unlikely event that a section of pipeline was damaged, engineers can repair a pipeline in a matter of days or weeks. That is a temporary inconvenience, not a permanent solution to Iran's strategic problem. The infrastructure investment behind this bypass network is simply too large, too valuable, and too strategically important for the countries involved to abandon it because of a single incident. They will rebuild, reinforce, and continue operating, because walking away means returning to the exact vulnerability they spent years and billions of dollars eliminating. So realistically, Iran finds itself boxed in. No countermove available restores the leverage that has slipped away. The tools that made Iran powerful for half a century are still sitting there, fully operational, fully funded, fully trained. They are just aimed at a target that stopped being decisive. Now let's zoom out even further and talk about what this actually represents on the world stage, because this is bigger than one region or one country's frustration. For decades, American and Western strategy toward Iran cycled through the same limited set of options. Sanctions, which squeeze the economy, but take years to show results and often get worked around. Diplomatic negotiations, which move at a painfully slow pace and frequently collapse under domestic political pressure on either side. Or direct military confrontation, which carries enormous risk of dragging the entire region into open war nobody actually wants. The pipeline bypass strategy represents something different, a fourth option that nobody talks about enough. Instead of trying to defeat Iran's leverage head-on, you simply make that leverage irrelevant by building around it. You do not need to convince Iran to abandon its coastal missile systems. You do not need to sink its naval fleet. You do not even need a diplomatic breakthrough. You just need alternative infrastructure robust enough that the original threat no longer produces the original consequence. It is a remarkably patient form of strategy. It requires years of quiet construction instead of dramatic headlines. It requires cooperation between multiple governments willing to share the cost and coordinate the planning. And it requires accepting that the payoff will not show up immediately, but will compound slowly until one day the threat that used to terrify markets simply stops working. That day appears to have arrived. And here's what makes this particularly remarkable if you think about it from a historical perspective. Choke points have shaped global power for centuries. The Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. Whoever controlled access to these narrow passages held disproportionate influence over global trade, and by extension, global politics. Nations went to war over control of these exact kinds of waterways throughout history. What just happened with Hormuz may represent something genuinely new in how great powers handle choke point leverage in the modern era. Instead of fighting to control the choke point itself, the more efficient move turned out to be engineering your way around it entirely. Build enough alternative infrastructure, and the choke point stops being a choke point. It just becomes one route among several, no longer capable of holding an entire global market hostage. If this approach continues to prove successful, it could quietly reshape how future conflicts over strategic waterways get handled around the world. Instead of massive naval buildups to protect or contest a narrow passage, you might see more nations investing in exactly this kind of redundant infrastructure as a form of long-term insurance against future coercion. It is a lesson written in pipeline steel rather than gunmetal, but the strategic message is unmistakable. Choke points only hold power when there is no alternative. Build the alternative, and the power evaporates with it. We're deep into this story now, and honestly, this is exactly the kind of strategic thinking that shapes the world in ways most people never even notice happening. If this video has genuinely changed how you look at the Hormuz situation, do me a favor and share it with one person who would find this fascinating too. Word of mouth is genuinely the biggest reason channels like this one keep growing, and I appreciate every single share more than you know. Let's talk about the human side of this story now, because behind every strategic shift like this, there are real decisions being made by real people under enormous pressure. Picture the position that Iranian military planners find themselves in right now. For years, their entire professional careers were built around a specific mission: protect and project Iran's ability to threaten Hormuz. Officers trained for this exact scenario. Budgets were allocated year after year, specifically to strengthen these coastal capabilities. Entire units within the Revolutionary Guard's naval forces were structured around swarming tactics designed to overwhelm tankers and naval escorts inside that narrow channel. Now, imagine sitting in a briefing room and being told, essentially, that the mission your entire career was built around no longer produces the outcome it once did. That is not just a strategic setback. That is an identity crisis for an entire branch of the military. And when institutions face that kind of existential pressure, the natural response is often escalation, not retreat. This may explain why we have seen increasingly aggressive rhetoric and more frequent provocations from Iranian forces recently. It is not necessarily confidence. In many cases, escalation like this is actually a sign of desperation, a scramble to prove relevance before the strategic ground fully shifts beneath their feet. And here's the tragic irony sitting at the center of all of this. Every escalation, every aggressive move Iran makes to try to reassert control over the strait only accelerates the exact outcome Tehran fears most. More shipping companies abandon Hormuz permanently. More insurance markets price in the bypass routes as the new normal. More global buyers grow comfortable with the idea that Gulf oil no longer requires that narrow passage at all. Iran is, in a very real sense, pushing the world further away with the very same actions it hoped would pull the world's attention back toward its leverage. There is a lesson buried inside this entire situation that goes far beyond the Middle East, honestly. Leverage that depends entirely on scarcity or fear is inherently fragile, because it only survives as long as no alternative exists. The moment someone builds an alternative, that leverage does not slowly fade. It can collapse remarkably fast, sometimes within just a few years, as we have seen happen here. Countries, businesses, and even individuals who build their entire strategy around controlling access to something scarce should pay close attention to this story, because it is a powerful reminder that scarcity is not a permanent condition. Someone, somewhere, given enough time and enough motivation, will eventually engineer their way around it. Now, let's bring this back to the bigger picture and talk about what comes next, because this story is far from finished. The bypass network that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait have built together is not going away, regardless of how the current conflict eventually resolves. Infrastructure of this scale does not get dismantled once a ceasefire is signed or tensions cool down. These pipelines and terminals represent permanent capital investment, and once oil companies and shipping firms adjust their operations around a new, safer route, they rarely go back to the riskier option voluntarily. Even in a hypothetical future where relations with Iran genuinely improve, the bypass routes offer benefits that have nothing to do with Iran specifically. They reduce congestion. They offer flexibility. They provide insurance against any future instability in the region, from any source, not just Iran. This means the shift we are witnessing right now is not a temporary wartime workaround. It is a structural change to how Gulf oil reaches the rest of the world, likely for decades to come. The Strait of Hormuz will still exist, obviously, and it will still carry oil, particularly for producers like Iraq or Iran itself that do not have equivalent bypass infrastructure of their own. But it will no longer function as the single dominant artery it once was, and it will certainly never again hold the kind of unchallenged global leverage that once made a single Iranian threat move oil markets within minutes. For the countries who built this network, the payoff extends far beyond simply neutralizing Iranian leverage. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait have positioned themselves as significantly more resilient energy exporters, capable of maintaining steady supply even during periods of severe regional instability. That resilience translates directly into more stable relationships with the countries buying their oil, more predictable revenue streams, and frankly, more geopolitical weight on the world stage. When you can promise your customers uninterrupted supply regardless of regional tensions, that promise itself becomes an asset worth billions of dollars over time. For the United States, the strategic calculation is equally significant, though in a quieter way. Rather than committing to another prolonged, costly military confrontation to protect access through Hormuz, American strategy shifted toward supporting infrastructure that solves the underlying problem more permanently. It reduces the pressure to maintain such an enormous continuous naval presence specifically dedicated to keeping that one narrow waterway open and safe. It is, in many ways, a more sustainable long-term approach to regional stability than repeated cycles of military escalation followed by uneasy ceasefires that never actually resolve the root vulnerability. Before we close this out, I want to leave you with something to genuinely think about, because this story is bigger than oil, bigger than pipelines, and honestly bigger than the Middle East itself. Every powerful nation, every dominant company, every person who ever believed their advantage was permanent, eventually, learns the same difficult lesson. Power built entirely on controlling a single choke point, a single resource, a single narrow pathway that everyone else depends on, is never as secure as it feels in the moment. It feels unshakable, right up until someone patiently builds another road around it. And when that happens, the fall from power rarely comes with a dramatic explosion or a single decisive battle. It comes quietly, the way this one did. A pipeline expansion here, a new terminal there, years of construction nobody paid much attention to, until suddenly the world wakes up and realizes the old rules simply do not apply anymore. Iran spent 50 years building fear around 21 miles of water. It took the rest of the world roughly a decade of patient engineering to make that fear obsolete. Not through a single dramatic victory, but through steel, sand, and the quiet stubbornness of people who refused to accept that geography alone should dictate the fate of the global economy. The tankers are still sailing. The oil is still flowing. It is simply moving through doors Iran can no longer see, let alone close. And somewhere in Tehran right now, military planners are staring at maps that no longer mean what they used to mean, watching the one card they always believed they could play whenever they needed it, quietly and permanently taken off the table. If this story opened your eyes to just how much of global power actually happens quietly, behind the headlines, through infrastructure and patience rather than explosions and speeches, then subscribe to this channel right now, because this is exactly the kind of story we dig into every single week. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next one, and if you genuinely enjoyed this breakdown, drop a comment below and let me know what story you want us to uncover next. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.